thank you all for joining us in this first event in the Edelman-Aspen UK Trust Dialogue series. We have a fantastic session for you today. For those of you who haven't heard of us, the Aspen Institute in the UK is part of a global network of Aspen Institutes, which for over 70 years have inspired and empowered leaders around the world. We know that the UK is experiencing corrosive levels of political, social and cultural division. We also know there's a deep need for values-driven leadership and respectful conversations that bring people together. Aspen UK's activities and work seeks to do just that. We are really excited about this partnership because Edelman's Trust Barometer studies shed real light on the societal divides and challenges we face. They measure trust in institutions across 28 markets globally. And they take a data-driven approach that shows a deepening divide in trust levels between the elite minority in society and the disenchanted majority over the last decade. This Trust Dialogue series will, we hope, help develop a deeper understanding of the causes behind that polarisation that we're seeing, and critically, how its driving forces can be countered in the UK and beyond. We will be joined by an expert guest for each session, and we'll explore with them this trust deficit by identifying key issues for public and private institutions. We will really try to work out why mistrust is so pervasive and how trust can be rebuilt. We'll focus on 6 key areas: the media, economy, climate and the environment, business, politics and society. And today, we are zooming in on media. Ed Williams, the President and CEO of Edelman EMEA, will be having a fireside chat with Mark Thompson, the former CEO of the New York Times company. Before joining Edelman, Ed oversaw corporate affairs and communications for 2 global media companies, the BBC and Reuters. He started his career in newspaper and television journalism, so he really is the right person to lead this conversation. And Mark stepped down as president and CEO of the New York Times company in the summer of 2020 after an 8-year tenure in which the news brand was transformed into a digital powerhouse. Under his watch, digital subscribers jumped to nearly 6 million, up from 500,000 when he joined, while digital revenues topped 450 million at the end of 2019. Before that, he served an 8-year term as the Director General of the BBC and is widely credited with expanding the BBC's digital reach and overseeing development of the BBC iPlayer. And he joined the BBC from Channel 4. I can't wait to hear these 2 in conversations today. They bring such huge experience and brainpower. And you will get the chance to ask questions too at the end, which Ed will put to Mark. So please do submit those questions. But for now, let's get started. And Ed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Penny, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody who are joining us today online. Look, I'm as excited as Penny is about this morning's session with Mark Thompson. Mark, as you heard from Penny, will bring multiple perspectives to this topic of trust in the media. He was a media executive, he was a journalist, he was an author, and as Penny says, he has a unique perspective of running both a public broadcaster, BBC and Channel 4, and also private sector media company, a commercial media company, the New York Times. Now, this label media obviously means a variety of things to people. It's the newspapers they read, if they read newspapers at all. It's the television they watch, if they watch linear television. It's the sharing and shouting of social media or the news websites they visit. It's the personalities that they see on billboards and buses, most prominently at the moment, someone like Piers Morgan. And this is the point, I suppose. It's people like Piers and Andrew Marr that to some are the media. It's also, and I should say, none of those things. It's instead to some an amorphous thing, a blob, an amorphous organisation that determines the news, an elite, a ruling class, those people in London or New York who decide what is and what isn't a story. The people in Davos with those expensive puffer coats. Or as Tucker Carlson at Fox News would describe them, the media or the ruling classes, they. So determining trust in media is pretty tricky, full stop. But like all complex questions, you have to start somewhere, because understanding trust in media really, really matters. It matters because trust in information matters. Trusted information is the lifeblood of a well-functioning society. Not just the good news, but the damn right troubling news too. You know, we see that actually writ large today playing out in the terrible war in Ukraine. That's the reason why Volodymyr Zelensky communicates to international audiences every day. You know, we've seen that for the past 10 weeks. He, as well as addressing countless national assemblies, parliaments and institutions, information shapes public opinion, and public opinion influences policy outcomes. And in between that process sits the media, reporting, analysing, commenting, and for good reason, challenging. Society isn't served well by a compliant media, but as we've seen in our study of trust over the years, fragmentation and partisan media bubbles that amplify partial information, ad hominem commentary, and sometimes peddle falsehoods is not helping the democratic system either. So, Mark, can we start with this topic of definitions, what people mean when they ask the question, or they answer the question about the media? What do you think most people think about when they're asked to rank trust in the media? What are they imagining media is?
So I don't think most people really think about the media at all. I think media is a kind of category for a government taxonomy of different kinds of jobs or sectors of the economy, or it's for people like us to discuss as a kind of blob, as a thing. You know, if you say to me, do I like and trust English football? I might say, well, I like Liverpool. I hate Chelsea, hate Manchester United, you know what I mean? It's
about people's personal choices.
You tend to have very personal choices. It's one of these rivalrous areas where, you know, I choose my newspaper because I think it's like me, and I almost enjoy not liking other newspapers and not trusting if I like the Mail, the Mirror, or the Guardian. And so I think in a way, we've got to dig deeper. And to be fair, the Edelman Trust surveys do dig deeper underneath that concept. But as a block, let's call it the media. In other words, the providers of information services, whatever the medium, be it internet, smartphone, print, conventional broadcast TV, radio, whatever it is. This block of information providers have got big issues, but they feel, to me, in all the numbers, strongly correlated with, for example, trust in politics, and, you know, questions around levels of division and levels of uncertainty in society. And as societies go through periods of greater political disruption and greater division, I think one of the kind of canaries in the coal mine are these questions about trust. So, which are always falling, by the way. It's quite rare in history. As soon as you start measuring it, it starts falling, in my experience.
So I want to get sort of behind the numbers as we talk over the course of the next hour. But just, I mean, sticking with that definition that you describe, which is a broad definition of the media: broadcast television, newspapers, online news, social media. You're right that the levels are low, and you are right also that they track with government. But actually, in this country, in the UK, they're significantly lower than government. So trust in the media as an institution, and we measure that on a 9-point scale. We ask a question whether you think institution X or Y is trusted to do the right thing. Those levels in the UK are 22%. Are you surprised by that number being so low here?
Well,
and how do you interpret it?
Well, okay. So, firstly, the UK in your data is pretty damn low. It's one of the lowest countries on most of these metrics. And for what it's worth, I think that from a political and kind of social point of view, for a variety of reasons, the sequence of events which include the financial crisis, austerity, and the, supposed actual debate, degradation of public services and public provision, the Brexit debate.
MPs' expenses?
One or two specific attacks on, the public before MPs' expenses didn't have a particularly high opinion of Parliament, but and quite often the biggest some of the biggest scandals hit home because they seem to reinforce a prejudice, not because often they're presented as if this is some terrible new revelation and everyone's completely surprised and shocked, but like gambling in Casablanca, it's often the reality is that suspicions, pre-existing suspicions, appear to be confirmed.
Yeah.
And holding institutions up to unreasonably high standards, which is also something else which Parliament suffers from, is not new. But it does seem to be a particularly British disease, as it were, of a great pretense and a kind of kabuki theatre about what virtue in public life, as opposed to actual human beings living actual human lives and trying to juggle multiple households to be an MP. All of that stuff is swept under the carpet in favour of in some ways, artificial kind of perspective. That all of that is a kind of, it seems to be part and parcel of the way in which kind of politics works, particularly in this country. The idea that politicians have got feet of clay seems to be a less of surprise in other arguably more mature political cultures.
And do you think that artificial, as your words, packaging of an event like that, MPs' expenses, actually in the end does drive down trust because it does effectively reinforce a set of underlying prejudices?
And it gives a pre-existing prejudice, it gives it a headline, it gives it some catchy anecdotes.
Yeah.
Individual expense line items become for a year or two. I forgot what they all are now. But
Duck House.
The Duck House.
Yes.
It becomes a kind of amusing, very mockable kind of thing, a kind of reified memory, and I'm sure that has an adverse effect. But to me, a lot of this is a period of kind of over at least a decade.
Yeah.
This kind of downhill progress, and in the end, things like MP expenses, I see as kind of, there are moments where maybe the thing drops quickly a little bit for a while, but actually it's not as if it was on a glorious upward path before that started. I think at the moment trust is kind of looking for ways to decline, and inevitably events can turn up which accelerate the process for a while.
And I suppose, you saw that at first hand when you were running the BBC with the publishing. I think, I'm trying to remember the sequencing of this, but the publishing of expenses sort of coincided with that particular period in politics as well. And it wasn't a Duck House, it was, I think, cashmere socks or mini muffins or something like that captured the imagination.
Right. That's right. That's right, and the kind of, and this is, I want to say, this is not just true of the BBC. It's very easy for the BBC itself to present itself as a kind of uniquely suffering institution. This is what happens to British institutions. As it were, boring questions like, well, how does this institution compare with other media companies, or how does this institution compare with government? Never get asked. Each thing is treated in isolation. And although the media, to be honest, are one of the main architects of this, as well as themselves being victims of it, in other words, a lot of this is to do with pre-packaged narratives and the political and cultural instincts of proprietors and all the rest of it, all familiar stuff. I think that the pressure on newsrooms, the need to compete and differentiate your front page against other people's headlines, the competition in opinion for who can be the most outraged, who can be the most extreme, and the way in which, as it were, digital, internet, social media and the rest of it has accelerated this whole process into sort of continuous hysteria. That's also part of the story.
And we're seeing that today, of course, with the various stories about the breaking of COVID rules, whether it's being ambushed by a cake or £300 curries. I mean, it continues. Mark, you've talked about trust in media, in some ways tracking a decline in trust in politics and in government.
Yeah.
The other, I think, factor that it has tracked over certainly the last 10 years is a massive disruption of the media sector itself. The undermining of historically very profitable and well-established media models, right? So this topic then about the extent to which disruption in the news industry has played a role, has been a factor in pushing down trust levels. You were at the coalface of this period, actually, when you were leading the New York Times, transforming this august media institution into a digital-first company. You've seen that lurch from newspapers to digital, away from print and newsstand. And in that environment, success is about having online impact. And we've started to talk a little bit about this topic already. But do you think the necessity to grab eyeballs, to grab attention online, to sell advertising has played a part in undermining?
Yes, I do. I mean, we'll come on to exactly what's going on with this trust concept, I'm sure, a little bit later. And I think it's a bit more complicated and less kind of, the idea that trust is like virtuous and a lack of trust is wicked.
Yes, quite.
There's a lot to unpack there. But yes, of course, I do think that. And I think it's part, the truth is, the UK media sector, by the way, like legacy media in most countries, was in fact and remains a very high-bound, very conservative industry, which has not enjoyed, as it were, the opportunity and promise of digital at all, and has only focused on and has become very resentful about its negative impacts. There was a sense that print advertising was a birthright and a moral thing that they should have incredibly profitable businesses based on print advertising. And when basically industrial change meant that advertising began to get squeezed, they were outraged and looked for someone to blame, of which the BBC, by the way, was one of the things to blame. And the practical reaction of British newspapers, and to some extent British broadcasters, this change, was to be in denial for years, to look for someone else to blame, to invest too little in innovation and change, and to double down on actually fairly hackneyed sort of mid-20th century tabloid tactics to try and replicate in digital the kind of money making they'd done in print with advertising. And that ran straight into a brick wall of reality, which is digital's very different, and they couldn't control supply of eyeballs in digital the way they used to do in print. Sure. And therefore it wasn't and hasn't proved to be a good business. So the wrong strategy and deep conservatism meant they got into trouble, but the tactics they were using were based on a very crude idea of how you get salacious headlines and raunchy pictures and celebrity news online to do what you fondly remembered it doing in the 1960s in print.
And do you think that those tactics have bled into more traditional, more broadsheet type media experiences? I asked this question this morning, and now, obviously it was we've got the war in Ukraine, we've got a cost of living crisis, we've got an energy crisis, but of course a lot of the media this morning is focusing on another very important issue, the Met Ball in New York. I was looking at BBC Online this morning, and one of the stories was, quote unquote, the 20 hottest outfits from the Met Ball.
You turned to that first, as it were, yeah, that's right.
Do you think that kind of language around trying to grab eyeballs has bled into?
I've said what I've said about trust and its path over the last decade and the newspapers. Honestly, I live in America most of the time. I read entirely online, multiple British newspapers every day. I want to say, I think overall, the standard of journalism from the more serious papers in 2022 is pretty damn high. I think coverage of Ukraine, but not just the actual war itself, which has been we've seen outstanding photojournalism and on the ground reporting from the broadcasters and the newspapers. Same in America, by the way. Yeah. It's a very well reported war. It seems to be anyway. But it's geopolitics. I think the energy crisis and inflation around the world and in the UK has also been pretty well covered. I've got not that many complaints about the quality of serious journalism, which I think, honestly, generally, I would say, is somewhat better now than it was 20 years ago. And this is the irony that I think having not handled digital pretty well, by the time you get to the early 2020s, you're definitely seeing progress.
Yes.
And you can debate about where that, are there still too many titles, too many competing interests? Should British journalism to some extent consolidate into a smaller number of more sustainable titles and so on? I think overall, journalism has probably improved. And I think one of the things we're seeing, which is very interesting, is declining trust at a time when probably, honestly, overall quality is getting slightly better.
So do you think there's
I think they're all talking about it. It's not obvious to me that trust and quality are neatly correlated at all.
Indeed. So there's not a lag then, because when we ask the question around what drives down trust in media, the public talk to and identify issues like short-term gains, the sort of short-term gains that we're talking about, clickbait and so on, to drive profitable outcomes at the expense of impartiality. So do you think that the public is slightly off the ball in the sense the media is not like that anymore?
This stuff is very hard to call in advance. Look, it's possible. I mean, one of the things that we did at the New York Times, and we were probably one of the first people to kind of, in a sense, say this explicitly, is we think high-quality journalism's good for business because we're trying to drive long-term subscription relationships, and we think a high-quality product is more likely to drive subscription. So we believe in it, but actually we also think it's good for business.
So therefore invest in newsroom.
And therefore invest in newsroom. Yeah. I think that story, and then, for a variety of reasons, we were lucky, and the plan has been working, and the Times got a lot bigger, around 10 million subscriptions now. I think other people noticed that, and that, I think to some extent, the idea that investing in high-quality journalism could be the best way of cracking the digital code has become certainly more talked about, and to some extent, more applied. That may partly explain why I feel as a consumer I'm seeing generally somewhat better journalism than 5-10 years ago. And yes, there may be a lag for the public to recognise that. But I think this question about trust in media is, I think the public, your respondents, would regard that as quite a political question. In other words, you have a political opinion about trust in the media. It's part of you use your kind of political headpiece to try and kind of head-up display to try and figure out the answer to that question. And even if actually the overall perceived quality of journalism is getting better, and grudgingly, if you were honest with yourself, you'd admit it probably is slightly more trustworthy, you may well not want to say that because your signal about trust in the media is trying to convey a bigger political point, which is that you're feeling very cynical and very out of sorts with pretty much everything that's happening in this country.
So can we just switch gears slightly and talk about the other kind of big competitor for people's time, and actually one of the biggest disruptors that the media industry has faced over the last period, which is social media. So this, of course, is the kind of chariot riding alongside the internet revolution. Now, I remember, this is aging me, Mark, by the way. I remember when MySpace was bought by News Corporation. And at the time, I was working with the CEO of Reuters, Tom Grosser, and I helped him pen an op-ed for the FT and write a speech on the promise and opportunity that flowed from social media and this upending of this kind of traditional top-down information model. And this is what he described in 2006. So these are Tom's words. The consumer now wants not only to run the printing press, but to set the linotype as well. Our industry faces a profound challenge from home-created content, everything from blogging and citizen journalism to video mashups. He went on. Don't make the same mistake we made as an industry at the birth of online. Protectionism doesn't work, but neither does total surrender. As media companies, we have access now to rich new worlds of sources, of talented writers, photographers, filmmakers, would-be journalists, political diarists. Yeah. Let's not turn away from the potential of all of this, but understand it and unlock it. User-created content has become part of our media world, but it's part of the overall mix, not the sole component. So that was 2006. Looking back, how do you think that moment of disruption worked out for the traditional media industry?
Well, and for the public, well, I mean, I think a lot of easy utopian myths, which were being peddled, not particularly by Tom, by the way, but by plenty of people in the late 90s and early 2000s about democratization of journalism. Citizen journalists were going to mean that the need for professional journalists would essentially disappear. Anyone could be a reporter, anyone could be an editor. Yeah. That's not how it looks today. We can all believe that user-generated content, UGC, is going to be very important for reporting, is now in Ukraine, incredibly important. Yeah. And what's interesting is we've developed technologies now so we can very precisely date and place fragments of video. So verification of content is becoming better. Nonetheless, the idea that Ukraine would be just as well covered if there was no professional journalists there, I don't think anyone believes that now. I mean, maybe you could find them, but I'm not sure. All of those digital prophets and gurus have gone quiet, really, because what we've discovered is what social media does is, I mean, the ancient Greeks knew that the marketplace is a noisy place where Socrates is talking good sense in one corner, but there's some other maniac spreading lies in another corner. Someone else is just telling jokes, and everyone is shouting at each other. That's what human marketplaces of ideas and information are like. All Mark Zuckerberg did is turn up the volume and speed up the communication of all of that. But signal and noise still matter, and signal, i.e. coherent, credible information, still is important, and separating it out from the noise is still an important task. And I wonder if there's a newspaper on the planet with a lower reputation today than Mark Zuckerberg's. I mean, what's interesting about social media, between Twitter and Facebook, social media has got a trust issue, which now looms much, much larger than the trust issues around traditional media. So rather than being a kind of, if you like, a transparent, utterly honest and kind of super kind of see-through clear alternative to the led, centrally controlled, nefariously directed traditional media. This is what the world of social media was going to be. It was going to be this fantastic, simple alternative. The public could simply tell the truth and hear the truth from each other. Has turned out to be much murkier, in fact. As it were, you may or may not be a fan of Rupert Murdoch, but at least, as it were, you know what he owns, and you can make your own judgment reading the Times of London or the New York Post or whatever it is, whether or not you want to believe it, because knowing about Rupert's ownership position with those titles. Facebook, where does this come from? Where does this post? Where does this fragment of information even come from? Was it made by a person or a computer? So I think what's interesting is, I think as an accelerant, it's had multiple effects on the way media has developed and continues to do so. I think the idea, which was genuinely talked about in the early 2000s, that there was going to be a magic bullet to get around, which is a kind of like a Marxist idea that you've got reactionary elements controlling what the proletariat see. Now you're empowering the proletariat to tell their own stories to themselves, problem solved. It's turned out to be a lot more complicated than that.
So what would your advice be to the bosses of social media, Elon Musk? So, so let's move forward in the year to the autumn when, in all likelihood, he is given approval to buy Twitter. So he gets the regulatory approval for that platform. And Musk, as we know, has talked about being a very, loud and robust supporter of free speech. What advice would you give to him about building trust in Twitter?
Well, here's the thing. I thought that the Facebook creation of an oversight board, widely derided, mocked, criticised, particularly by those people who, frankly, those juries who've already reached a verdict on Facebook and nothing is going to, they've been very hostile to it. I think it's far from perfect. It's still, in the end, an appointed creature of, as it were, Facebook Inc. And of Mark Zuckerberg. However, I think the idea of some level of arm's length oversight of Facebook and of other social media platforms like Twitter is a step in the right direction. I think the idea that these very powerful platforms, who are, and probably always will be, in an indeterminate spot between being publishers and platforms, they're a bit more than a platform, and they are making editorial choices, albeit largely by machine, but they're less than, probably should remain less than publishers. How you think about that and how society can be made comfortable with the choices that are made, and how you get kind of meaningful feedback loops from public reaction to what's happening on these platforms, to the platforms themselves, and as it were, ultimately into the algorithms, needs some kind of organizational, institutional, independent structure around it. And I think what I'd say to Elon is think hard about that. I mean, Elon claims to have thought deeply about freedom of speech. It's not quite clear from his remarks yet how deeply, but that's another issue. But think carefully about how you might begin to win public support for the trustworthy kind of objectivity and impartiality, but also good common sense of Twitter, or else the politicians will do it for you. And I'm one of those people who, although I can see why people think there's a very strong need for essentially government legislation and government regulation of social platforms, my view about freedom of speech is the biggest danger to freedom of speech is always the government. Her Majesty's government, the US government, the Russian government, the Chinese government, governments, the Indian government, governments pose the biggest threat. And I'm far from clear that government-ordained regulation of social media, which, by the way, is enthusiastically being adopted by the world's dictators, in the interest of getting rid of disinformation. The world's dictators are all trying to clamp down on social media, saying they need to do that to stop terrorism and disinformation and to protect the public. In fact, they want control. So I would say it's much, much better for Silicon Valley and the big social media players there is if they think quickly about how to genuinely produce an industry level, company level, whatever it is, set of practical answers to how you're going to make these environments work effectively.
So this is a really interesting point, because if you contrast the European Union approach, and we saw this new online harms digital bill announced a couple of weeks ago, with the UK's approach, where actually the statutory powers that an oversight, digital oversight committee has, or were promised to have, are now being removed. Actually, the teeth that the government promised that this oversight unit would have are no longer there. Actually, you think that UK model where there's self-regulation, informed self-regulation, is ultimately better than government intervention?
That's my bias, I have to say. It is my bias. That in other words, that the trouble with government regulation is unless you've got very, very strong conventions around good behaviour by governments. In the UK, government controls the fate of the BBC, but for essentially a century has not used that to get political advantage. Honestly, in the last couple of years, there's been one or two quite worrying signs that perhaps that is beginning to fall away, even in the UK. The vituperative remarks about the BBC and Channel 4 after the election at the end of 2019, and has now left the government with many people saying that their privatisation of Channel 4 is partly politically motivated because they were so angry about the way Boris Johnson was treated in that election campaign and other similar supposed slights by Channel 4. So that's breaking down, but at least it's worked there. But that's a century of British tradition, unwritten constitution. People know and respect, and there's a kind of some sort of groundswell in the Commons and laws which will protect the independence of the BBC and Channel 4. That's hard to achieve from scratch in 2022 about anything. So yeah, I think that at the very least we should really see if an industry in this very sensitive area can figure out compelling ways of doing it itself. And I worry about onerous regulation of free speech for obvious reasons. Not recognising that some of the harms that the European legislation is trying to protect us against are real harms. I mean, so it's not pretending there isn't a problem. It's saying that if at all possible, it's better done at the level of self-regulation and convention rather than, in the end, giving governments who, even government's good intentions can turn out bad.
Can we change topics a little and talk about the demand side of the trust equation? Because this is an area that I think is just overlooked, that the kind of sins of the media are firmly deposited on the porch of media companies. But of course, audiences matter. Audiences consume, drive the content decisions. And one could, if you're running a media company, you could serve up cod liver oil content every day, but there wouldn't be many takers, however good it was for you. So can we just talk about the demand side a little? Are consumers of media, is society complicit in all of this? Do we get the media we deserve?
I think it's deeper than that. So firstly, I think this is an incredibly important point and incredibly under-processed point. And I think it stems from an incredibly insulting and patronising view about the public, which essentially is that they're sheep. And that this is kind of, you need to, in terms of digital harm legislation, they need to have their feet dipped to stop them getting foot and mouth, basically. That they can't be trusted to decide for themselves what's good and what's bad. And therefore need to be in some way protected by, as it were, more intelligent people like us. Well, I'd like to begin with the premise that the public are as intelligent as we are and are just as good at discriminating between what's trustworthy and what isn't as we are. As a kind of, that won't be true of everyone, maybe, but I mean, honestly, I think it probably is. I've got no reason to think that I'm going to be better at this than a member of the public. I think we've just got to confront the fact that there is a market for disinformation. Yeah. There is a market for pornography. There is a market for there are people who actually want to find it, and they've thought about it, and they want to find it, and that some people prefer disinformation, which reinforces their prejudices, than something which is kind of boring but more accurate and true, and that one of the reasons disinformation works on the internet is not because innocent, ignorant people stumble on it by accident, but there are people who are out looking for it because they want it. And I want to say that I think that even lack of trust, you can read that as I'm smart, I'm very skeptical about everything.
Yeah.
I'm not a pushover. I don't believe what people tell me because I think about these things and I take everything with a pinch of salt. That a self-image, which is you won't get one past me, quite a deep part of the British character in some ways. That business of pull the other one.
Yeah.
Is a big part of what's going on here.
And presumably also, your point here is that media choices aren't necessarily driven by trust. They're often driven by other things like entertainment. I mean,
right.
People want to read about how you could mistake, searching for a tractor website with downloading pornographic.
Yeah, that's a very good. To me, that's a good example. That's a really good example. That's a really good example of something which is a great talking point. It's kind of got memorable.
Yeah.
Jokey photograph.
Quite funny.
Very, very, very easy to tabloid newspaper to find photographs which illustrate the
Dominator tractors, this kind of thing. Yes.
all of that stuff. So, and the kind of that's right, and myth making, mythologizing around the news has always been part of the, if you like, the creativity of British media, but that's collusive with the public.
Yes.
But I think so. In other words, I'm very skeptical of solutions which treat these kind of issues like digital harms like it's like a food additive issue where we've got to remove these dangerous additives, so we've got to so that the public get a healthy diet of information. The public shouldn't be patronised, and they should have, in the end, the right to choose what they want to read, and they have the right to prefer lies to the truth. It's quite important that, I mean, part of freedom of speech is not just the freedom to say nice things or to say things that we might approve of. It's the right to say what you want, and the public have a right to listen to and believe what they want. That is, I'm afraid, part of democracy. No matter how much it pains, highly educated liberals to hear that, they are actually allowed to do that and to back candidates who tell lies in elections and so on. I mean, this is all part of the way democracy works. And I think there's a sort of still a kind of, I don't know, a kind of some sort of nostalgia for a sort of a world which is really all about control and about governments with the regulations to stop nasty stuff appearing on the internet, and the public being guided towards virtuous choices and virtuous behaviours. That's not really, in my view, an accurate or even a desirable picture of an open society.
I think the other really important point you make here, Mark, if I may say, is that actually there are cultural differences between countries. So looking in aggregate globally at a number like trust in media is interesting, but only up to a point. Because as you say, if you think about the country we are broadcasting from, it is a highly cynical, sometimes counter-establishment, questioning society, and that may well reflect and manifest itself in low levels of trust. And there isn't actually a kind of number at which you say, bingo, we've made it. Yeah. Trust in media is X or Y, and therefore this is a problem solved. Because actually a low number might actually suggest a number of other factors.
Well, I spend quite a lot of time nowadays in Germany.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it will be possible or desirable to get British trust levels in institutions as high as they are in Germany. But they're high in Germany for all sorts of very deep historical and cultural reasons, which works well for that country. I mean, that's a highly rational country. It's not that people don't think things through. Arguably, it's as well, the political culture is more rational than England, not less rational. Yeah. But it's rationality combined with very broad acceptance of institutions. It doesn't mean but a lack of criticism of institutions. Political corruption is probably a bigger issue in Germany than it is in the UK.
Yeah.
it's like, I think that business of cultural variations, and in particular, the particular story of the British public and cynicism and alienation from politics over half a century or whatever is particular to this country. Having said that, I think there are quite a lot of parallels between the UK and the US, and I think you could reasonably, arguably Australia, and I think you could talk about potentially a kind of political, cultural kind of realm of the English-speaking world, where we can see quite a lot of similarities as well as some stark differences.
Now, you raised the issue of disinformation, and what we've seen in our study over the last few years is that fears around disinformation and so-called fake news operations is actually driving trust and confidence levels down.
Yeah.
Would you distinguish a sort of government intervention in this space, in the disinformation space, versus media regulation? Are they two different things, or do you think ultimately we have to live with a world of disinformation with the Russians, with the Iranians, with other countries running disinformation campaigns 24/7, not just with elections? I mean, there was a huge disinformation campaign run around the COP meeting in Glasgow.
Yeah.
Do we just have to accept that disinformation is a factor of life now?
I think, what used to be called psychological operations, PSYOPs, in the mid-20th century, by hostile governments against our populations, our countries, is a fact of life and will continue to be a fact of life. And I think, by the way, the idea of countermeasures, of trying to understand it and trying finding ways of calling it out for what it is, and potentially also of stopping it. I accept that stopping kind of enemy machines and enemy people secretly disrupting our democracies. That feels to me a slightly different thing.
Topic.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say I'm one of those people who worries a little bit about kind of pulling the plug on RT. In other words,
explain that.
So in other words, RT, the Russian TV channel, which in some
Russia Today.
Russia Today.
Yeah.
As well, suddenly losing its license if we suddenly notice, because of the war in Ukraine, that they're spouting falsehoods about Russia. And it seems to me, in the end, there's something rather weak and untrusting of the public and of the principle of freedom of speech to stop a Russian mouthpiece just because there happens to be a war on, as I suppose a kind of virtue signalling by Ofcom or something. I think broadly, I don't think the danger comes from Russia Today, completely obviously labelled propaganda outfit on behalf of the Russian government. It's insidious, false flag, hidden bots and hidden influences and mischief around, voting in Georgia and so on that is the bigger threat.
Yeah.
So
you don't think giving RT regulatory spectrum to broadcast through Sky, through Virgin boxes and all the rest is not a problem?
It's a fairly, firstly, what's the practical effect going to be? I passionately believe that global services like the BBC and CNN genuinely, and by the way, many others, which Deutsche Welle, and so on, genuinely try and seek the truth and spread the truth. But do we really want to end up in a world like George Orwell's 84 with Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia, three, global, however many it is, global power blocks where state funded broadcasting from all of them is automatically banned in every country which is not aligned politically with that. Where this goes in terms of tit for tat is that you.
So you think there's a thin end of the wedge argument?
More than that, and also in the end, you would hope, I would hope, there was something as clearly labelled and obvious as that, or the equivalent from China or Iran or wherever it is, that the public themselves could decide, could choose to sample it and decide for themselves. I mean, saying that you can't trust the British public to decide for themselves about whether something's propaganda or not, when it's basically got propaganda written across the back of every screen, shows, I would argue, a fairly low opinion of the public.
But do you think there's a role for mainstream media in this as well? I mean, I'm thinking about the events in Ukraine. I read across a range of tabloids and broadsheets over the last few days a story about how Russia had threatened to deploy its Satan II missile, which was going to create a radioactive tsunami that would drown Britain. And the story was complete with graphics and what submerged Britain would look like. Yeah. I mean, it originated from a totally nutty Russian television segment over the weekend. Yeah. Reported in the Mail, picked up in the Times and elsewhere. Yeah. Is there any merit in reporting a story like that? And are we basically doing Russia's job for them?
Well, do you think? I mean, it sounds rather entertaining actually. But to me, the issues is, I think that's a good example where, I mean, you might, I suppose, write an angry letter to the editor of the Daily Mail if you really could be really bothered, Ed. But I mean, it's like, I mean, that to me is the small change of all of this. In other words, the kind of nonsense like that, probably written with some level of tongue-in-cheek, by the way, in the way it was conveyed, but it doesn't really, it's not really going to help the Russian war effort in Ukraine, it seems to me, nor is it going to really strike fear into the hearts of the English public. It's just, to me, that's what's interesting about the Russian disinformation campaign, which, by the way, appears currently to have gone extraordinarily badly.
Sure.
It's quite interesting how a basic PR strategy by the Ukrainian president and other senior Ukrainian officials, which is maximum exposure, daily commentary to create a narrative from the Ukraine point of view,
yes,
has worked so much well against the Russian disinformation campaign. What I do want to say is one of the things I recently, just as a subscriber to the New York Times today, not part of the company, I was incredibly proud of the New York Times reporting of very credible evidence of Ukrainian soldiers executing Russian prisoners of war, some of which hasn't had as much coverage in this country, actually, interestingly enough, that Ukrainian war crimes or alleged war crimes need to be reported too. That seems to be where we get to, in a sense, slightly sharper questions about what great journalism consists of, which is you don't just assume that because of understandable public horror about the Russian invasion and the behaviour of Russian forces in Ukraine, that the side which most Western countries support, namely Ukraine, is likely to be entirely blameless in this matter.
Well, and what we're also seeing in Russia and the States, as you say, inability to control how the narrative is communicated, the limits of an economy that in European terms is actually very small. I mean, we heard yesterday, last night, there was an Aspen Institute discussion with a group of young Russian leaders, all living effectively in exile, one of whom described an incredibly well-organized effort, both a sort of analog effort and a digital effort to counter the Kremlin's narrative, a digital effort organized online. I mean, the Russians cannot really control the internet in the way maybe the Chinese can, but also then analog tactics as well, with young Russians printing out stories from Western newspapers and then posting them through people's letterboxes. So I think you're right. It has clearly not been as effective as designed. Look, in these last few minutes, can we talk a little bit about the issue of investment in journalism? You're chairing an organisation called IFPIM, the International Fund for Public Interest Media. You've also spoken about how actually the success of the New York Times came down to investing in the newsroom, investing in journalism, investing in sort of passion areas for your readers, whether it's foreign news or cooking or travel or whatever. How do you see the news industry evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? What are the big trends that we should be expecting to see?
So IFPIM, first of all, it exists to try and solve one significant problem in global journalism, which is that many great journalists and great journalistic startups are stopped because of the economics of how you begin. This could be a radio station in sub-Saharan Africa, it could be an investigative news website in Colombia, and so on. So the idea is to give grants to deserving, trustworthy journalists around the world to help them through the early years. There'll be some stability funds as well, but early years as they find an audience and build their practice. And in some ways, my co-chair, Maria Reza, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, along with Viktor Muratov, for her work in investigative journalism. Maria is a good example. Her website, Rappler, in Manila, in the Philippines, has done more than anyone to hold the government of President Duterte to account. Maria, by the way, has got a jail sentence, and she's got any number of incoming criminal charges because of that. But Rappler couldn't exist if it hadn't had some support from international foundations and grantors to support its early work. So the idea is to create more Rapplers around the world, and to do that both in countries where basically economics is the main challenge. In countries like Ghana, actually, it's not a bad environment politically and culturally for free speech, but it's very, very tough. Advertising, digital advertising is very difficult to get, and all the rest of it. But also to help in countries like the Philippines, where there's immense political pressure and hostility from elites to independent news. Well, look, in my view, I passionately believe that well-organized journalistic institutions, news organizations, are the best, most reliable way for the public to get a steady stream of news they can trust. And
free at the point of use? Or?
Well, I think I want to say people have got to find a business model that works for them. But yeah, as far as possible, free for as many people to find. And by the way, even the best subscription model in the world, actually, in my view, in news, requires extensive free access. New York Times has got 10 million plus or minus subscribers. It's got 150 to 250 million users a month. So most people are looking at the New York Times without having to pay for it. So yeah, free wherever possible at the point of use. And because of the transition the journalism's going through, there's a period where that needs investment and needs support. Ultimately, as I think we showed at the New York Times, you can produce business models which are very profitable, not in all, but in many settings. To get there, to build the audience, to build the trust, to build a willingness to pay, you need money. And it's helping to solve that problem that we're trying to do at IFPIM.
So it sounds like you're quite optimistic about the future of the news media.
I think the public want good journalism. But human beings, I think, naturally want, almost for survival reasons, to have access to trustworthy information for themselves and their families. It's like really basic stuff like food and shelter. And if you provide it reliably, they'll pay for it in one way or another, directly or indirectly through advertising. And actually, digital means it's much easier and cheaper to get it to people. So we've got the challenge of how to figure out how to do that in business models that work. But that seems to be a soluble problem.
Mark Thompson, thank you very much. It's been great talking to you this morning. I think there's a lot of areas for us to think about and pick up on as we continue to run these trust studies over the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you.